Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month I'm going to teach you a method for transferring drawings onto watercolor paper, which of course cannot be seen through, especially if it's attached to a block. And this method can help you to save some time. This is not what I want you to be focusing on if you need more work with your drawing skills. But if you're in a time crunch, here's what you can do. I took a photograph of this fisherman balancing on one leg. It was a normal size photograph, and then I used Photoshop to enlarge it and print it out the size that I want it to be on colored paper. Then I'm going to use a piece of tracing paper, and using a sharp pencil, I'm going to carefully trace the image. This will also help you to see shadow shapes. Then hold one edge and lift it up carefully so that you can see if everything has been traced. If it has been, then move your picture out of the way. Put the tracing paper on your watercolor paper. Then use a piece of transfer paper. Carefully hold down that tracing paper again so that you won't move position. Slide it under. Using a very, very sharp, hard pencil, trace those lines over again. When you've transferred all your lines, lift up, then go back and clarify any lines that didn't come through or that you couldn't see because the contrasts were too close to the same. And you have now transferred your image very quickly and extremely accurately. So the only thing left to do then is to add a horizon line. And on top of that horizon, you can add some land here. And the rest of this is really obscure, so I'm actually going to swap in the landscape that I see in this other photo. Now I want to protect him with masking fluid so that I can do a really clean, even background. So I'm going to get out my masking fluid pen. I carefully outline the outside of the figure, and then I blob these interior shapes, which I can then smooth with a brush handle. Let that all dry, and then we'll start painting. Always work from the back to front in your watercolors. So put down your sky first, and then you subsequently layer on mountains and valleys and trees and whatever else on top of that sky. So I want to match this sky. I'm going to get a large flat and then use a test strip, and then I'll mix my blues until I find that exact same shade. I'm going to start at the top and then make a graded wash all the way down. And every time I layer down, I want it to be a little bit lighter because I want the darkest part of the sky to be on the top. So then I can keep rinsing out my brush as I move down until near the horizon here it's very light. When the sky is dry, you can push forward to do those mountains. And you can see that these are sort of a tan color topped with a purple. So we're going to need to use a few different colors. I'm going to match those first and mix up the puddles, and then the painting part will go pretty fast. So I'm going to keep my reference material close, and I don't want the two colors to bleed together, so it's going to be a little bit tricky to keep the paint the right amount of wetness. So I'll go in with my large flat on the side and start carefully edging around this mountain top. And I'll turn the paper so that I have maximum control and continue on my way here. Okay, now I'm going to push forward into the tan, squeegeeing most of that color off of my brush, and then work the tan in places where the color isn't too wet, but it's still a little bit wet. I want them to sort of bleed into each other, but I don't want them to bloom. I'm going to touch in with a stronger red here and there, then rinse my color and just let that fill in. And these mountain ranges in the back are lighter in color, so I'll put them in with the edge, being careful not to touch the blue too much. Push forward over here. Now those colors are going to dry a little bit lighter, but before they dry I want to add some of the shadows between the hills. The paper should feel slightly cool because it should be a little bit damp, but not so damp that it won't hold an edge. So then I'll just go in and I'll add some of these little shadow shapes. Just washed my brush out and squeegeed it dry again, so that then with this semi-wet brush I can go in and blend these shadow shapes into the surrounding mountain a little bit better. Then we'll let these mountains dry and push forward to the water. Now that those mountains are dry, I'm going to move down into the actual reference material and paint this land and sea. Go ahead and do the color matching as best you can, and then still with that same flat, I'm just laying in a strip of land and grass here. At the base here, the water's edge, you can add a little bit of a shadow color. Alright, let's push down into that sea. Now this water is basically two colors. There's a light in the background and the darker stuff up forward. So I'm going to just mix up the color to match that light one first. And I'm just brushing this color right over the top. It feels a little bit too dark. So I'm going to rinse my brush, knock some of that water off using the lip of the cup, and then continue my way just like so. I'll streak in with a couple of different blues. Everything that you do in watercolor is more interesting when color is mixing on the page. I don't want it to be dull and flat. I'm going to go back in, squeegee off my brush, and pull out a few highlight lines. And those are just going to blend into the body of the paint, depending on how wet it is. But some of it will remain and give a little bit more life to that water. And I can push forward and drop in some more color here. But here I'm just focusing on the highlight of the water. Then when that's dry, I'm going to go back and paint some of those ripples. So this has to be actually quite light. I'm leaving some interesting blotches, slicing in some interesting little ripples and things. And then as I move into the background, it's going to be less distinct. And then back here, way less distinct. You can only see detail in things that are close to you. And I'll let that dry, and then we'll come back and add some more color to it. Painting the ripples on the water is a little bit more deliberate a process. So I'm going to shift to a small round, and then I have that dark gray mixed up. And I'm just copying what I see on the page. So if you're sure of the color and you're sure of the spot, adding these ripples is just a matter of taking the time and painting them accurately. I'm focusing my efforts on the foreground, of course, because that's where you can see that detail. And I'm just going to slowly take my time and paint what I see. Do try to focus your efforts on the largest shapes, and don't paint every ripple, or else your painting is going to start looking overworked and phony. The most important shadow shape is the one that is cast by the boat onto the water. Once you focus your efforts on one particular piece, it's hard to stand back and see the whole shape the way it's supposed to look. So to offset that tendency, paint your borders first, then fill in like this. The other thing that I can do in this stage is fill in the dark brown on this boat, because since I'm painting the waves, I'm painting the object that interacts with the waves at the same time. Then I can go back in and I'm going to attach the shadow to the boat so that it's more accurate and really looks like the boat is casting the shadow. Alright, so I'm going to take some time now and fill in the rest of these ripples in that same way, and then I will come back and we'll push forward some more. Once these ripples are in place and they're nice and dry, I can go right over the top with a bluer blue. Make sure that you test that color before you put it down, because you're only going to have one shot. Then, once I've mixed up plenty of the color, I'm going to go right over the top of this foreground ocean. One time, just like that. You can't go over multiple times because those ripples are going to start to lift up. Then I'm at a good stopping place to let it dry again. Okay, the sea is nice and dry and looking good. So now I'm going to use a rubber cement eraser, take off that masking fluid, and we can do some work on the figure. Always use the largest brush that you possibly can. Mix up a yellow to match what I see, and just lay that down with my large round brush. And I'll go down to the shirt, match the tone again, and I'm squinting to look for those shadow shapes and try to make the shadow pieces connect to simplify the shape as much as possible. I'll do that same process and lay in the skirt. Match the tone and lay down the color as a large piece. Now what I've mixed up here is the mid-ground, not the darkest shadow. So I'll go in after this is dry and I'll add the shadows. Now in the hair, it's so small that I'm going to switch to a smaller round and then carefully add the dark mass of hair that I see back here. And there's also a dark shadowy flesh tone, so just match those colors and then add that flesh tone as well. To the back of the neck and the hands. Be really careful on those hands because they are really important to telling the story. They show that he's holding his balance. They draw attention to the fact that he's standing on one foot on the edge of a boat in a lake, which is no small feat. It's very impressive. So those hands need to tell the story that he's balancing. They have to be held just so. Okay? Let's push this figure forward a little bit now that he's dried. I'm going to work on the shadow shapes. So I'm going to mix up a shadow color for the shirt. And then I'm using a small round. I'm going to put them in as shapes. So the shadow on the shape is going to be a continuation of the shadow on the hand. So I'm working on the shadows as layers. You have the white color of the shirt, you have the medium, mid-tone, and then you have these shadow shapes layered on top last of all. And the trick is to put them down as the right color right from the beginning so that you never have to lift it up or do anything else with it. You just put it down as a shape and leave it there. If you need to, it's not a bad idea to redraw those shapes before you start painting them. Then I have this unusual green net. Then I'll lay that color down. And I need to fill in some shadow here on this side of the stick. Then let's push forward and do one last thing. I'm going to use a rigger brush. That's a long, skinny round like this. I'm going to use it to put in that stick that he's fishing with. The trick to using it is you want to try to get your strokes down in one fluid movement. You can also use it for little details elsewhere if you need to add a little bit of detail to the net, for instance. But the rigger is for lines and small details, and so you shouldn't be taking it out until things are almost done. So I'll go off camera one last time for these final details and I'll come back and show you the finished piece. Here's what we started with, and this is the finished piece. It's going to be a good one for learning how to pull down a wash in the sky and develop your depth in a painting by layering colors on top of each other without letting them bleed too much. So that concludes this month's painting tutorial. I hope that you've learned something that you can take back with you to your own studio. And as usual, thank you so much for watching.